The morning after the storm, Louisa Turner found the note tucked beneath a smooth river stone on her freshly repaired porch step, and her hands were shaking so hard she nearly dropped it before she could read a single word. She had heard him. She had heard the hammering through the rain, heard the boots heavy on her rooftop in the dark of the midnight hours, heard the grunting effort of a man working alone in a Texas downpour when any sensible soul was locked indoors. She had stood at her door with her hand on the iron latch, heart slamming against her ribs, telling herself not to open it, that it could be anyone, that a widow woman alone on the frontier of 1883 had no business swinging her door wide at midnight for a stranger she could not name. And then the hammering had stopped, and the footsteps had crossed her porch and descended to the mud below, and by the time her courage finally broke and she threw the door open into the gray thinning rain, there was nothing left but hoofbeats fading south toward the canyon road, and the smell of pine tar and fresh-cut wood, and a roof that no longer leaked. The note said only, "Roof should hold now. Sorry about the garden. E.T." She stared at those two initials until the ink blurred, and something moved behind her sternum that she had not felt in 3 years, not since the morning she buried Daniel Turner on the hill above the creek. Something warm and bewildered and frightened all at once, because she knew those initials. Every soul in Crestfall County knew those initials, stamped on wanted posters tacked to the post office wall and the door of every saloon between here and San Angelo. E.T. Edwin Trask, the man they called the ghost of the Caprock, the man with a $500 bounty on his head. The man who had just fixed her roof in the middle of the night and left before she could open the door to thank him. She sat down hard on the porch step and pressed the note against her chest, and the question that would haunt the next 3 weeks of her life began to form with slow, devastating clarity. Why? 3 years before that rain-soaked midnight, Louisa Turner had arrived in the town of Crestfall, Texas, with nothing but a trunk, a deed to 40 acres, and the particular kind of grief that makes a person very quiet and very deliberate about everything they do. She had come from Galveston, where Daniel's shipping business had collapsed in spectacular debt-ridden fashion 6 months before the fever took him, leaving her with creditors and pity in equal measure. The deed to the 40 acres had been Daniel's last hopeful purchase, something he called their fresh start, and she had honored that hope by coming west to claim it even after he was gone, because she had nowhere else to go, and because honoring Daniel's hope felt like the last useful thing she could do for the man she had loved sincerely if not passionately for 7 years. The land was real. The house was not, precisely. What waited for her on those 40 acres was a 2-room structure of weathered cedar planks that a previous homesteader had abandoned when the first drought came, leaving behind a rusted cookstove, 3 cracked window panes, and a roof that wept generously every time clouds gathered. Louisa had repaired what she could with her own hands, learned to patch plaster and mend fences from her neighbor Hester Boone, who was 62 and possessed of an opinion on every subject. She had planted a kitchen garden in the spring, kept 2 goats and a small flock of chickens, and taken in fine sewing for the women of Crestfall proper, whose husbands had money and whose fingers had grown too soft for detailed work. It was not a prosperous life, but it was hers, and she was quietly proud of it. She had first heard the name Edwin Trask from Hester on a June afternoon when the air was the color of bronze and the cicadas were deafening. "You bolt your doors at night?" Hester had asked, not looking up from the beans she was shelling. "I have a bolt," Louisa had said carefully. "Use it. Trask's been seen on the Caprock Road. Robbed the Garfield stage 3 weeks back." Before that it was the payroll wagon out of Fort McKenzie. Hester's voice had the tone of someone recounting established, unpleasant facts the way one might describe weather patterns. "They say he was a ranger once, got turned out for something. Nobody knows the truth of it." Louisa had thought nothing more of it at the time. Outlaws were part of the landscape out here the same way drought and rattlesnakes were. You were cautious, you bolted your door, you got on with your business. She had not expected to see him. She certainly had not expected the circumstances under which she eventually did. It was the first week of September, a Tuesday, which she would always remember because she had been into Crestfall for supplies on the Monday, and the road had already been difficult with early storm mud. And on Tuesday morning she woke to a sky the color of a bruise and wind coming out of the northwest in long, furious gusts. By noon the rain was horizontal, and the roof over her bedroom had begun to fail catastrophically. Not the gentle dripping she had managed before with strategically placed tin pails, but a full buckling of 3 boards where the old joists had rotted through undetected, rain pouring in like an open window, soaking her mattress and the quilt her mother had made, and the only framed photograph she owned, the one of herself and Daniel on their wedding day. She had dragged everything she could into the front room and stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching the water destroy what little she had. And she had allowed herself exactly 1 minute of the kind of crying that feels like it comes from the floor of the earth. And then she had stopped, because crying was not a roof repair, and she had no neighbor within 4 miles, and the storm was not waiting for her emotional convenience. She had the materials. She had purchased cedar shingles from the mill in Crestfall 2 months prior, intending to hire someone to do the repair. She had the shingles stacked in the lean-to, and she had a hammer, and she had nails, and what she did not have was the knowledge of how to get herself safely onto a wet roof in a thunderstorm without killing herself. She stood in the kitchen and thought about it with rigid practicality, calculating odds and angles. It was in the middle of this calculation that the knock came at her door. She froze. The knock was not tentative. It was 3 solid, even raps, a knock that communicated neither threat nor desperation, but a particular kind of calm authority, the knock of someone accustomed to announcing themselves in places where they were unexpected. Louisa took the iron poker from beside the stove, held it down along her right leg where it would not be immediately visible, and opened the door 2 inches. He was soaked to the skin. That was the first thing. He stood in the full force of the rain as though he had simply decided the rain was not relevant to him. A tall man in a dark coat that had gone black with water, hat brim pouring rivulets in 4 directions, dark hair plastered to his neck. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 32, with a face that was weathered but not coarse, sharp-boned and serious, a face that had done a lot of careful watching of the world. His eyes were gray-green, the color of the creek after a storm. "Your roof," he said without preamble. "The north side is going, I can fix it." Louisa kept the poker at her side. "Who are you?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation she saw something complicated move through his expression, something that looked almost like the choice between 2 difficult answers. "Someone who can fix a roof," he said finally. "That is not what I asked." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not reach for the gun at his hip, did not lean forward, did not crowd the door. He stood in the rain and waited with a patience that seemed genuine rather than calculated, as though he had all day and the rain was not a concern and he would simply wait until she decided. "The shingles are in the lean-to," she heard herself say, "along the east wall." Something moved in his expression then, not quite relief but adjacent to it. "I'll need your hammer and nails," he said. "I'll bring them out." She did not ask his name again. She brought the hammer and the box of nails to the porch, set them down, and went back inside, and she listened to the sounds of him working for the next 3.5 hours while the storm raged, and she sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded, and her heart doing something complicated and irrational that she firmly refused to examine. She heard him slip once, heard a sharp scrape of boots on wet wood and a tightly controlled sound that was almost a curse. And she went to the window and looked up and saw him catch himself on the peak of the roof with both hands, hanging there for a moment in the driving rain before he got his footing again. And the sight of it sent a shock of cold fear through her that she had absolutely no business feeling for a stranger on her roof. She went back to the table and told herself it was only the ordinary human instinct to not want a person to fall to their death from a height. She made coffee. She made it strong and let it sit on the stove. When the hammering stopped, she went to the door, and she had her hand on the latch, and she was going to open it. She was absolutely going to open it and offer the man coffee because he had just spent 3 hours in a storm fixing her roof, and basic human decency demanded nothing less. And the footsteps crossed the porch and went down the steps and away into the rain. She stood there with her hand on the latch and listened to hoofbeats move south and dissolve into the sound of the storm, and she opened the door to rain and darkness and a river stone with a note beneath it, and the smell of pine tar and the work of careful, capable hands. The note said, "Roof should hold now. Sorry about the garden. E.T." She did not sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the note, and she thought about the way he had stood in the rain with absolute stillness, and the way he had hesitated when she asked his name, and she turned the 2 initials over in her mind like a smooth stone until dawn came gray and cold through the repaired house that no longer dripped. In the morning she went into Crestfall, and she stood in front of the post office, and she looked at the wanted poster. And Edwin Trask looked back at her from the printed image with an artist's approximation that caught the strong jaw and the watchful quality of the eyes but missed the patience in them, the careful stillness. The poster said he was wanted for armed robbery of federal mail carriers, stage robbery, and the assault of a ranger officer. It said he was considered dangerous and armed. It listed the $500 reward. It did not say anything about fixing roofs. Louisa went home and thought for a long time, and then she did something that was probably foolish and was certainly deliberate. She went back to the porch where he had left the note, and she left her own note weighted beneath the same river stone. It said, "Coffee was on the stove. It went cold. I owe you a hot cup if you come back in daylight." She went inside and told herself she was being practical, that it was simply good manners to thank someone who had done her a service, that she was not hoping for anything beyond basic courtesy. She was, she suspected, lying to herself. He came back 11 days later. She was in the garden, crouching between the bean rows, when she heard the horse on the canyon road, and she stood up slowly and shaded her eyes and watched him come. He rode a gray horse with a dark mane, and he came at a measured walk as though he wanted to be seen coming, as though he was making a deliberate choice not to startle her. She did not reach for anything. She stood in the garden and waited. He pulled the horse up at the fence and looked down at her from the saddle with those storm-colored eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I came about the coffee," he said. "It's inside," she said. "Come in." She turned and walked toward the house without looking back, which was either brave or foolish, and she could not quite decide which. She heard him dismount and tie the horse to the fence post, heard the gate latch, heard his boots in the dry September grass, and she went inside and put the coffee on, and she stood at the stove with her back to him when he came through the door. "You can sit," she said. He sat. She turned around when the coffee was poured and set a cup in front of him and sat across the table and looked at him in the daylight for the first time, and he was not what the poster suggested. The poster suggested menace. What sat at her kitchen table was a man who looked deeply, persistently tired, as though he had not slept well in a long time and had made his peace with that fact. His hands on the table were large and scarred across the knuckles, the hands of someone who had worked hard his whole life and not always at legal occupations, but they were still those hands, completely still. "Edwin Trask," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not look surprised that she knew. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I saw the poster," she said. $500. That's the current rate, yes. You came anyway." Something shifted in his expression. "You left a note." She held his gaze. "I did." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 careful people taking each other's measure, and Louisa was accustomed to being measured and found adequate, and she had the impression that Edwin Trask was accustomed to something rather different. "Why did you fix my roof?" she asked. He looked at his coffee. "I was on the canyon road when the storm hit. I saw the light in your window, saw the roof going." He paused, and something in his jaw tightened. "I know what it is to have something you've built fall apart in the rain." She did not press him on what that meant, though she stored it away. "The poster says you assaulted a ranger," she said. "The poster says a great many things. Are any of them true?" He looked up at her then directly, the kind of eye contact that felt like a commitment to something. "The stage robberies," he said. "Yes, I won't lie about that." He paused. "The mail carriers know, the ranger know, at least not the way they've written it. Then who did those things? That," he said, "is a considerably longer conversation." "I have time," Louisa said. "I'm not going anywhere." What came out in the next hour and a half, in pieces, and with the reluctance of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself, was this. Edwin Trask had been a Texas Ranger for 4 years, stationed out of the San Angelo post. He had, in the course of that service, stumbled onto a particular arrangement between his commanding officer, a man named Captain Harlan Brace, and the Consolidated Pacific Freighting Company, which was transporting not just goods, but quantities of unregistered silver ore out of unlicensed mines worked by Mexican laborers, who were, in the plainest terms, being kept in conditions that Edwin described with clinical precision and visible anger as indistinguishable from bondage. He had gathered evidence. He had reported it, first to Brace directly, which had been naive, and then to the district office in Austin, which had been better but not by as much as he had hoped. What happened next was the part that made Louisa's hands tighten around her coffee cup. Brace had responded to Edwin's report by filing charges against him, charges of taking bribes from the very freighting company Edwin had been investigating, producing paperwork that Edwin said was fabricated, and that the district office, under what he believed was considerable financial pressure, had declined to investigate with any rigor. Edwin had been discharged. He had tried to find a lawyer, and found that money had preceded him to every office he approached. He had tried to go to the newspapers, and found that the San Angelo Courier's editor had received a very comfortable arrangement with Consolidated Pacific the previous spring. He had been cornered by 3 men he recognized as Brace's associates outside a hotel in Abilene, and what had happened in that alley had left one of them with a broken wrist, and Edwin Trask with the assault charge that was now printed neatly on the wanted poster. The stage robberies had come after, when he had run out of legal options and legal money simultaneously, and he described them with a matter-of-fact lack of remorse that Louisa found strangely honest. "I robbed Consolidated Pacific stages," he said. "They're private freight runs, not passenger coaches. No one was harmed. I took silver ore when I could identify it as coming from the unlicensed mines, and he stopped. And you what?" she asked quietly. "There's a settlement of Mexican families about 40 miles south of here, 15 families. The men were the ones who worked those mines. They never saw wages. I returned what I could." Louisa looked at him for a very long time. "That is," she said carefully, "either the most honorable criminal enterprise I have ever heard of, or a very convenient story." "I know," he said. "There was no defensiveness in it. I wouldn't expect you to believe it without reason." "I don't disbelieve it," she said, and found to her careful examination that she did not. There was something in the way he told it, in the places where he paused, and the places where the anger surfaced clean and controlled, that felt like the texture of true things. She had spent 7 years married to a man who was charming and well-intentioned, and not always entirely honest, and she thought she had developed a reasonable sense of the difference between a man making a performance and a man making a report. He left before noon, the way he left before, without drama, with a certain abruptness, as though staying longer was something he had decided not to allow himself. At the gate he paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at her where she stood on the porch. "I shouldn't come back," he said. "If Brace has people watching the roads, you could be connected to me. That would make your situation difficult." "My situation," Louisa said, "is already difficult." He looked at her with something raw moving briefly through his eyes before he closed it off. "I'll think about it," he said, which was not a promise, and they both knew it, and he rode south on the canyon road and she watched him go. He thought about it for 6 days and came back on a Wednesday. He came with purpose that second time, with a loose board from her porch that he had apparently noticed on his way in the first time and which he had come with the correct materials to fix. She found him crouching over it with a small pry bar when she came back from the creek with the water buckets, and she stopped and watched him work for a moment before he looked up. "You could have knocked," she said. "Didn't want to interrupt if you weren't home," he said, and went back to the board. "There's a logic gap in that," she said, and set down the buckets and sat on the other end of the porch and watched him work. He worked the way he had stood in the rain that first night, with complete, unhurried competence, no wasted movement, no show. He replaced the board and checked the 3 adjacent ones and replaced one of those 2 and then stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers. "You don't have to repair everything that's broken," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I noticed it," he said. "It would have been a trip hazard, and you felt responsible for my safety." "I feel," he stopped and started again. "I passed this way, it needed doing." She studied him. He was not comfortable being looked at directly, she had noticed, or rather, he was accustomed to deflecting it. He met her gaze when it was a matter of honesty, but gratitude and softness made him look at the middle distance. "Stay for supper," she said. He stayed for supper. She made fried cornbread and salt pork and dried apples cooked soft with a little of her precious remaining sugar, and they ate at the kitchen table while the last light fell orange through the west window. And she told him about Galveston and Daniel and the debt and the deed. And she told it plainly and without sentiment, the way she had told it to almost no one, because she had found that grief worn plainly was more dignified than grief worn as a wound to be displayed for sympathy. He listened the way careful people listen, without rushing to fill the spaces. "You came out here alone," he said when she finished. "I did. That took a particular kind of courage, or a particular kind of stubbornness," she said. "The two are difficult to distinguish in practice." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen anything approaching a smile from him, just a slight softening at the corner of his mouth, and it did something unexpected and immediate to the careful management she had been applying to the situation, to herself, to the inconvenient direction of her own feelings. She looked back at her plate. "What will you do?" she asked. "About Brace, about the charges." The almost smile faded. "I've been trying to get documentation. The payroll ledgers from the consolidated mines would prove the labor arrangement. If I can get them to the right people in Austin, someone who isn't already paid for, there might be grounds for a proper investigation. And if you can't," he was quiet, "then I ride until I can't ride anymore, I suppose." She looked up. "That isn't a plan," she said. "That's a surrender." He looked slightly startled, as though she had said something unexpected. "It's a reality," he said. "Edwin," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly, and she felt him go very still. "Do you want to be guilty? Is it easier? Because I am telling you, as someone who has watched grief be used as a permission slip for giving up, that tired men make decisions that ruin them and call it fate." The silence that followed was the longest of their acquaintance so far. He set his fork down. "I didn't say I was going to stop," he said finally. "You didn't say you weren't." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his gray-green eyes that was complicated and illuminated and slightly afraid. "You are very direct," he said. "I live alone in a county where half the men think a widow woman needs handling," she said. "I stopped being indirect when I left Galveston." He stayed until the stars were out, and then left with a kind of reluctance that was visible, even to him, she thought, from the way he paused at the door and looked back at the kitchen as though memorizing it. Over the next 5 weeks, Edwin Trask became a fixture of her days in the way that certain things become fixtures, gradually and then all at once, until she could not imagine the rhythm of the week without him in it. He came every 3 to 5 days, never at a predictable time, always having found something useful to do with the arrival: a fence post that needed resetting, a hinge that needed oil, the matter of the west window with the cracked pane that he replaced with a piece of glass he had traded for in Crestfall proper, doing it when she was not watching so she could not stop him. They talked for hours. She had not talked like this, she realized, ever, not with Daniel, who had been warm and social but who had preferred audiences to conversations, not with Hester, who was a monologue in boots, not with anyone she could think of. Edwin Trask talked to her the way someone talks when they have been alone inside their own head for a long time and have found, to their surprise, another person who will genuinely follow the thought. He told her about growing up in the hill country outside Fredericksburg, German immigrant parents who had come over in the late 1840s and built a farm through sheer determination, a father who was formal and loving in that particular compressed German way, a mother who had died of a fever when Edwin was 9. He told her about the Rangers with a complicated affection, the institution itself rather than the corruption he had discovered inside it, the genuine belief he had once had that the law was a force that could be made to protect people who needed protecting, including the Mexican families who were so frequently abandoned by it. He told her about Francisco Reyes, who had worked in the Consolidated Mines for 8 months before escaping with 2 other men, and who had helped Edwin understand the full scope of what Brace was protecting, and who was now living cautiously in the settlement to the south. Louisa told him about the books she had read and reread until they were falling apart at the spines. She told him about the garden, what it meant to her to have put seeds in the ground and watched them become food, the particular satisfaction of that transaction with the earth. She told him haltingly about the nights in the first year after Daniel died when the silence of the house had felt like a physical presence, and how she had learned to fill it with small tasks, and the sound of her own voice reading aloud to no one. "Did you love him?" Edwin asked one evening, and then looked as though he had not intended to ask it aloud. She considered the question without flinching. "Yes," she said, "not in a world-ending way, but yes, he was kind and he tried hard and I was glad of him." Edwin looked at the table. "That's more than most people get," he said. "I know," she said. "Were you ever—" She paused. "Was there someone?" "Not the way you mean," he said. "There were years when the work was everything, and then the years when the work became this." He gestured at himself slightly, at the outlaw circumstance of himself, with a wry resignation that was not quite bitterness. It wasn't a situation that recommended itself to the domestic. "No," she said, "I imagine not." She did not reach for his hand across the table, though she thought about it. She thought about it quite specifically, and set the thought aside the way you set aside something that might be either treasure or ruin, and you cannot yet tell which. What she could not ignore, and what she stopped trying to ignore around the 3rd week, was that she was falling in love with him. It was not the dizzy, disorienting thing she had felt for Daniel at 19, which had been largely the effect of Daniel being extremely handsome and attentive, and knowing exactly what to say, and which had burned down to something quieter and steadier over years. This was something different. This was the sense of someone fitting, of puzzle pieces designed for each other finally in proximity, of recognizing a mind and a quality of character that she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. Edwin Trask was honest in the marrow of him, whatever his crimes, honest in the way he spoke and the way he looked at her, and the way he never once tried to make himself larger or more appealing than he was. He did not perform. He simply was, steady and serious, and occasionally, in moments he didn't seem to plan, very nearly tender. She thought he felt the same. She was not certain. He was careful and she was careful, and they were both, she suspected, people who had been hurt by the world in their respective ways, and who did not walk carelessly toward new vulnerabilities. But she caught him watching her sometimes with the expression he tried to prevent, and the expression was the one that looked like someone seeing something they had stopped hoping for and not quite knowing what to do with the shock of it. It was Hester who forced the crisis. Or rather, it was Hester's well-intentioned gossip that forced it, because in the small world of Crestfall County, a gray horse tied to Louisa Turner's fence 3 times a week had been noticed, and Hester came out on a Thursday morning with her bean wisdom and her opinions and said, over coffee at Louisa's kitchen table, that people in town were saying that the widow Turner was sheltering that outlaw Trask, and that the new county sheriff A man named Dubs, who was Brace's appointed instrument in this jurisdiction, had been asking questions. "I'm not sheltering him," Louisa said carefully. Hester looked at her over the rim of her cup. Hester had been looking at people over the rims of things for 62 years and was extremely good at it. "He's here 3-4 times a week," she said, not unkindly. "He fixes things," Louisa said. "He's good at it." "Louisa, he didn't do what the poster says he did, not all of it." "That," Hester said, setting her cup down, "is what every woman says about every man she's decided to care about." Louisa looked at her steadily. "And sometimes they're right, Hester." Hester was quiet for a moment. "Dubs asked me directly," she said. "I told him I hadn't seen anyone. But Louisa, if Dubs comes out here, if Brace's people come—" "I know," Louisa said. "Do you want to know what I think?" "I am not at all certain I do, but I suspect I'm about to find out." "I think," Hester said carefully, "that you are a woman who has been alone long enough that loneliness has become a habit, and that the first man who is genuinely kind to you in 3 years has you planning a life in your head that may not be available." This was perceptive enough that Louisa was quiet for a moment. "You may be right," she said, "but it isn't only kindness. It is—" she paused. "He is the most honest person I have met since I came here. And I think he's in a trap that wasn't of his making, and I think he's been alone fighting it longer than a person should be alone, and I think—" She stopped because she had said enough, more than enough, and Hester was watching her with an expression that had shifted from warning to something softer. "Child," Hester said, which she only called Louisa when she meant it genuinely, "be careful." "Yes," said Louisa, "I am being careful." She told Edwin about Dubs that afternoon when he arrived. She told him directly, standing on the porch before he could even tie his horse. "I know about Dubs," he said. His expression had gone closed and careful. "How much does he know?" Hester said. "He's asking questions. He doesn't have specifics." "He will." Edwin was looking past her at the road, the calculation of it moving through his face. "He has been pressuring the county offices for 2 months. He'll have Dubs push harder." "Then we need to move faster," Louisa said. He looked at her. "We? You said you needed the payroll ledgers from the consolidated mines. Where are they?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Louisa, this isn't—" "Where are they, Edwin?" He set his jaw. "The main office is in San Angelo. Brace's own office would have copies, but that's impractical," she said. "What about Francisco, the man you mentioned from the settlement? Did he have access to those records?" Edwin stared at her. "Francisco knew the names of the foremen who kept the secondary ledgers," he said slowly. "The site records. They were kept at the operation itself, not the main office. If those site records still exist, then we should find out," Louisa said. "This is not a we situation," Edwin said, with a firmness that she recognized as the kind of firmness that is trying very hard not to hear the logic of the alternative position. "You are one man who is known to every law officer in the county," Louisa said. "I am a widow woman who does fine sewing for the wives of respectable men. Who is more likely to make inquiries without attracting notice?" He looked at her with an expression that was exasperated and frightened, and trying to argue and finding all the arguments running into the solid wall of her reasoning. "I do not want you involved in this," he said, and his voice had dropped slightly and the firmness had changed character, had become something more personal and less tactical, and they both knew it. "You are already involved in mine," she said quietly. "You have been since you climbed onto my roof in the rain." He looked at her for a long time. The September light fell across the porch between them. "That was supposed to be a simple thing," he said, very quietly. "Nothing is simple," she said. "I've found that useful things rarely are." They were standing very close by this point, she realized, not having tracked the incremental narrowing of the distance, and his eyes had the open, unguarded quality that she had only seen in moments he did not plan for, and something in the air between them had changed its nature entirely. "Louisa," he said. "Yes," she said, and she meant it about the plan and about the distance and about all of it. He stepped back. Not far. 2 steps. He looked at the ground and then at the sky and then at her. "Francisco is in the settlement on the Loma Creek Road," he said. "If you were to go to Crestfall on regular business and then south on the Canyon Road." I go to Crestfall every third Monday, she said. The next one is in 6 days. I'll go first, he said. Speak to Francisco, tell him to expect a visitor. Good, she said. This is still not, he stopped. A wee situation, she said. Edwin. You have been coming to my house for 5 weeks and fixing things, and staying for supper and talking to me, until the stars are out. And the roof has been repaired, and the porch board has been replaced, and the window glass was an unnecessary extravagance that was very kind. And I think we have established that it is a wee situation regardless of your feelings about it. He looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as the one that preceded something honest and unguarded. He opened his mouth and then closed it, and then he said very quietly, I do not want anything to happen to you. Then help me make sure it doesn't, she said. He left without touching her, the way he always left, carefully, maintaining that precise and deliberate distance. But at the gate he turned back, and this time what was in his face was no longer hidden at all. I should tell you, he said, that I have thought, since the first time I sat at your table, that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered in my life. She held very still. You should have led with that, she said when she found her voice. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm told I'm not good at the direct approach. You are, she said, spectacularly wrong about that. He rode south and she stood on the porch, and the feeling in her chest was large and warm and slightly terrifying, the way important things feel. 6 days later, on a Monday, Louisa Turner drove her wagon into Crestfall for supplies as she always did her business at the general store with Mrs. Calloway behind the counter, and did her business at the post office, and delivered the completed sewing work to 3 households. And then, rather than taking the North Road home, she took the South Fork and drove 4 miles down the canyon road to the Loma Creek turning, and found the settlement that Francisco Reyes had described to Edwin. It was a small collection of adobe and wood structures set back from the creek in a stand of cottonwoods, tidy and self-contained, with chickens and a goat pen and a cooking fire. A man came out to meet her wagon before she had fully stopped, a man of about 40 with a quiet face and careful eyes, and she said Francisco's name, and he said in clear English, You are the woman from the canyon road. It was not a question. Yes, she said, Trask sent me. Francisco looked at her for a moment. He said you were brave, he said. He said that. He said it the way men say things they are not sure they should say, Francisco said with a slight knowing quality. Come. My wife will make coffee. In the next hour she learned more about the Consolidated Pacific operation and Captain Harlan Brace's involvement than Edwin had told her, partly because Francisco had lived it, and partly because there were things Edwin had not wanted to tell her, she suspected, because knowing them fully made the danger clearer. The site records did still exist. Francisco knew because one of the other men who had escaped, a man named Tomás, had worked in the office rather than the mines and had taken the risk, in the chaos of the escape, of folding 2 months' worth of secondary ledger pages into his shirt. Those pages were currently hidden in a tin box beneath Francisco's floor. They were not comprehensive, but they were substantial, and Francisco was prepared under certain conditions to give testimony. What conditions? Louisa asked. Safety, Francisco said simply. There are families here, children. If I come forward and nothing happens except that Brace sends men, I understand, she said. We need to get the ledger pages and testimony to someone in Austin who cannot be bought. Is there a name? Francisco was quiet for a moment. There was a federal judge who came through San Angelo 2 years ago. His name was Whitmore. He was not liked by the freighting interests. A federal judge would supersede the county, Louisa said. She had spent several evenings with one of Daniel's old legal primers in preparation for this conversation. If Judge Whitmore were to receive the ledger pages with a sworn statement, Trask cannot ride into Austin, Francisco said. No, Louisa said, but I can take a letter. I can go to Crestfall and put it on the stage. Francisco looked at her steadily. And if Brace has people watching the stage, she had thought about this. Then I address it to my cousin in Galveston, she said. Who will forward it to Austin? I have a cousin. She is real and she is reliable and she has no connection to any of this." Francisco was quiet for a long time. Then he went to the back of the room and lifted a floor board and took out a tin box and set it on the table. And he opened it and laid the folded ledger pages out carefully. And they sat together and she read them. And the picture they painted of the consolidated Pacific operation and Brace's financial involvement was damning and precise, and exactly what Edwin had been trying to find for 2 years. She left the settlement with careful copies of the most important passages in her own handwriting, tucked inside her sewing kit, where they would survive scrutiny as nothing more than fabric notes, and with Francisco's agreement to provide a sworn statement, once she confirmed a safe path for it, and she drove home on the canyon road with her heart beating hard and steady and something that felt like the momentum of rightness behind her. Edwin was waiting at the fence when she got home. He had been waiting for some time, from the look of him, and when she pulled the wagon up and he saw her face, he let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a prayer, something between the two. "Went well," she said. "I can see that," he said. "Get down and tell me." She climbed down and told him all of it, standing by the wagon while the horse waited patiently and the afternoon light moved toward evening. And as she talked, she watched his face move through relief and calculation and something that was beginning, she thought, to look like hope, which was something she had not seen on his face before and which changed it considerably. "Judge Whitmore is still on the federal circuit," he said when she finished. "I know his name. He is honest. If he receives the ledger pages and Francisco's testimony, then Brace is finished," she said. "Or at least under investigation, which is a beginning." Edwin looked at her. He had been looking at her since she climbed down with that particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as his most unguarded state, the one he tried to manage and usually couldn't. "You went to the settlement," he said. "You spoke to Francisco. You read the ledger pages." He paused. "You did all of that?" "Yes," she said, "I did." "Why?" His voice was very quiet. She looked at him directly. "Because it is the right thing to do. And because—" She stopped and looked at the fence post and then back at him. "Because you have been fighting this alone for 2 years and you should not have to be alone in it anymore." He was very still. "Louisa," he said. "I know," she said. "I know all the reasons it's complicated. I know you're wanted. I know Dubs is asking questions. I know this is not—" She paused. "But Edwin, I would like very much for you to not leave without." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and he kissed her, which was not precisely what she had been about to say but was entirely what she had meant. And it was not a tentative thing. It was the kiss of someone who has made a decision that has been a long time in the making and has finally simply made it, decisive and certain and warm. And she put both hands against his chest and kissed him back with exactly the same decision behind it. When they separated, he kept his hands on her face, and he looked at her with eyes that were clear and open and no longer trying to be careful. "I have been trying," he said, "very hard not to do that." "I noticed," she said. "It seemed very taxing." "Extraordinarily," he said, and she laughed, and it was the first time she had laughed like that in a very long time, and from the expression on his face it was doing something to him that he had also been trying to prevent. They went inside and made supper together, and they talked about the plan in detail, practical and specific, what she would write to her cousin Clara in Galveston, and what Clara would need to do, how to ensure the ledger copies arrived at Judge Whitmore's office in Austin, what Francisco's sworn statement would need to contain, and how to get it signed and witnessed, and sealed with enough official weight to be taken seriously. And it was the most useful, purposeful evening Louisa had spent in 3 years. Not despite the danger of it, but partly because of it. Because working towards something that mattered alongside someone who mattered was a different quality of living than she had recently known. He stayed late, later than before. When he finally rose to leave, she walked with him to the door and he stood in the doorway and held her hand, which was different from kissing, was its own particular intimacy. "Clara," he said, "tell her it's urgent, but don't tell her more than she needs to know." "I know," she said. Clara has been getting me out of situations with minimum information since we were 12 years old. She is very capable. When will you send the letter? I'll go into Crestfall Thursday, put it on the Friday stage. I'll keep away until you hear back, he said. If Dubs is watching the road, Edwin, she said. I know. He squeezed her hand. I know you know, he said. He left and she stood in the doorway and watched the gray horse carry him south in the dark. And she was afraid, properly afraid, the kind of fear that is proportionate to what you have to lose, which is the worst kind, the kind you only feel when something has become genuinely valuable. The letter went to Galveston on the Friday stage. Louisa did not sleep well for the following week, but she went about her work with deliberate normality, her sewing and her garden and her trips to Crestfall. And she smiled at Mrs. Calloway and delivered the right orders to the right households, and she told no one anything at all. Dubs came on a Wednesday, 9 days after she sent the letter. He was a thick-necked man with a marshal's badge and the manner of someone who was accustomed to using his physical presence as an argument, and he came with a deputy and tied his horse at her gate and knocked with the particular authority of law that does not entirely believe the people it's visiting have the right to not answer. She answered. She offered coffee. He declined it in the manner of someone who thinks accepting hospitality from a suspect complicates things. Mrs. Turner, he said, standing in her kitchen doorway because she had not invited him further in. There are reports that a wanted man has been seen at this property on multiple occasions. Reports, she said, from reliable sources. I am a widow woman who lives alone, she said pleasantly, meeting his eyes without any flinching at all. I receive occasional help from a neighbor and regular visits from Hester Boone. Is that a concern? The neighbor, he said. What's his name? She, Louisa said. Hester Boone, she is 62. She is not Edwin Trask. Dubs looked at her with the look of a man who has been given a clean, well-constructed denial and who cannot immediately find the seam in it. You're aware of the reward, he said. I have seen the posters, she said. $500 is a considerable sum for someone in your circumstances. Yes, she said calmly, it is. If I see anything relevant, I will certainly make it known. He held her gaze for a moment, testing it. She gave him nothing back but polite, patient attention. He left. She stood on the porch and watched him ride away, and her legs were not entirely steady, but she stood still until he was out of sight, and then she sat on the porch step and breathed very carefully for approximately 3 minutes. Clara's reply came 12 days after she sent the letter. It was brief and written in Clara's practical, firm hand. Package delivered to the correct address in Austin. Friend received it warmly and says there are matters requiring his attention in the West Texas district. He expects to be in San Angelo within the month. Your previous note was very interesting. I have questions. Please come visit when you are able. Louisa read this 3 times and pressed it against her face and said into the paper, Thank you, Clara. She had no safe way to reach Edwin except to wait for him to come, which he had been doing his best not to do for the past 2 weeks, and so she left the River Stone note on the porch, the one he always checked, and she wrote, Good news. Please come when you can. Safe. He came the next evening, appearing at the garden fence in the last light as though he had ridden hard and been watching the road and finally allowed himself to stop waiting. She told him about Clara's letter, about Judge Whitmore coming to San Angelo, about the month's timeline. He stood in her garden while she told him, and his face did the thing it had been learning to do around her, the thing where the careful management dropped away and what was underneath was visible, and what was underneath was a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and who had just been told he might be allowed to set it down. A month, he said. Perhaps less, she said. Clara says he received it warmly. If Whitmore investigates, if he subpoenas Brace's records, Francisco will provide his statement, she said. We discussed the timing. He'll go to San Angelo when Whitmore arrives. His family will stay with a cousin in Laredo until it's settled. Edwin looked at her. You've arranged all of this, he said. We arranged it, she said. You arranged most of it, he said with a precision that made her smile. I have been hiding in canyons for 2 weeks and you have been getting things done, she said. Getting things done, he repeated. And then he said very quietly, I owe you something I do not have words for. You don't owe me anything, she said. That is not what this is. No, he agreed. What is it? She looked at him in the last of the evening light, this man who had come out of a rainstorm to fix her roof and changed the whole character of her life. And she said, I think it is what happens when two people find each other when they had stopped expecting to. He came to where she was standing and the bean rose, and he took her hands and she looked up at him, and the light was going to gold, and the cotton woods along the creek were rustling in the evening wind. When this is done, he said, when Whitmore has it and Brace is finished and the charges are cleared or challenged. Yes, she said. I would like to ask you something, he said. Not now, not while it's still dangerous. But when it's done. Edwin, she said. Yes. I'm going to say yes, she said, in case that affects your planning. He looked at her with an expression she had no word for, something that was too large and too specific for the ordinary vocabulary of feeling. He kissed her again, in the bean rose in the last of the golden light, and she held on to him with both hands and thought that this was what it felt like when the world aligned, when the particular shape of your loneliness finally met its specific answer. The following 4 weeks were among the most difficult and most alive of her life simultaneously. They saw each other when it was safe, and when it wasn't they left notes beneath the river stone, small ordinary notes about the state of the garden and the weather, and whether the fence post in the north corner needed resetting. It did. And these notes, which were entirely mundane on the surface, were the most intimate correspondence she had ever conducted because of what they represented. Two people maintaining a thread between them across the dangerous space of a world that was still working against them. Judge Whitmore arrived in San Angelo on the 3rd week of October 1883, and Francisco Reyes, who was a braver man than most of the men Louisa had ever met, traveled to San Angelo on the appointed day and gave his testimony with Tomás beside him and the folded ledger pages on the table. And then they returned to the settlement and waited with their families and the particular terrifying patience of people who have done the right thing and are now at the mercy of whether the right thing is enough. It took 10 more days. Louisa knew none of this in real time. She pieced it together afterward from Edwin's account and from the copy of the San Angelo Daily Register that Hester brought out to her in considerable excitement on a Tuesday morning in early November. What the paper reported, in the clipped factual language of the era's journalism, was that Captain Harlan Brace of the Texas Rangers had been placed on administrative suspension, pending a federal investigation into his financial dealings with the Consolidated Pacific Freight and Mining Company. Following testimony provided to Federal District Judge Elias Whitmore regarding unlawful labor practices and fraudulent reporting of mineral extraction revenues. 2 other rangers and 1 county official were named in the inquiry. The word corruption appeared in the 2nd paragraph. The wanted poster for Edwin Trask was not, as yet, formally withdrawn. But the Crestfall County Sheriff's Office issued a quiet statement that its active search for the individual in question was being reevaluated pending the outcome of federal proceedings, which was the administrative way of saying that Dubs, who was one of the county officials named in the inquiry, had rather more pressing concerns than one wanted man. Edwin came to her house that evening with the same copy of the paper folded in his coat pocket, and she had already read it 3 times, and they sat on the porch in the cold November air, and the stars were out, and she had her warmest shawl, and he had brought a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, because he said the occasion demanded it. And she did not normally drink whiskey, but she had a small glass, and it was warm going down, and the stars were enormous. It's not over, he said. The charges aren't formally dropped. Not yet, she agreed, but Whitmore is thorough. Francisco's testimony was solid. The ledger pages, I know, he said. I know, he paused. I'm not unhappy about the direction. No, she said, "I can tell. You almost look like a man who slept recently." "I slept," he said with mild dignity, "for several consecutive hours." "Extraordinary," she said. They sat in comfortable quiet and she watched the stars and thought about the strange chain of events that had brought them both to this porch, this cold November night, this particular species of hopefulness. "You said," Edwin said, "when this is done you were going to say yes." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the fully open expression, the unmanaged one, the one she loved best. He reached into his coat and took out something small, and she looked at it, and it was a ring, simple and plain, a narrow silver band with a very small dark stone, and he held it in his scarred, capable fingers, and he said, "I don't have much yet. I have a gray horse, and I know how to fix things, and I intend, shortly, to find out whether there is any law that will still have me or whether I'll need to find a different useful occupation, and none of it is certain yet. But I know that I want to ask you, so I am asking you." She took the ring from him and looked at it. The stone was dark blue in the starlight, a piece of polished azurite, she thought, from the look of it. Small and genuine and completely unshowy. "Did you make this?" she asked. "Found the stone," he said. "Had the band made in Crestfall. The silversmith is discreet." "You had this made," she said. "You had this made during the past 2 weeks while you were hiding in canyons." "I wasn't hiding the entire time." She looked at him. "A man has to have a plan," he said. She put the ring on her own finger. It fit, which she thought probably meant he had noticed things the way he noticed everything, carefully and precisely, and with a quality of attention that was its own form of tenderness. "Yes," she said. "Edwin, yes." He took her hand with the ring on it and held it with both of his, and they sat on the porch in the cold, starlit dark, and she put her head on his shoulder, and he held her hand, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it because it had all been said. They married in March of 1884, in the small white church in Crestfall, with Hester Boone as witness and Francisco Reyes and his wife Maria sitting in the third pew with their 2 children, and the Crestfall town minister, who was a small, neat man who had heard enough about Edwin Trask from the newspapers by that point to understand that the ceremony had a considerable backstory, and who was wise enough not to require its full recitation. The charges against Edwin were formally and completely dropped in February 1884, following the conclusion of Judge Whitmore's investigation, which resulted in Harlan Brace being indicted on 4 counts of corruption of a federal officer, conspiracy to commit labor fraud, and filing false criminal complaints. Brace was tried in Austin in the spring and convicted on 2 of the 4 counts, sentenced to 8 years in the state penitentiary, and removed from the ranger rolls with the particular disgrace that the institution reserves for those who betray its principles from the inside. The fraudulent charges against Edwin were expunged from the federal record, which did not fully erase the poster from every saloon wall immediately, these things taking time, but which meant that Edwin Trask was, in the eyes of the law, a free man. He did go back to the Rangers. He went to the San Angelo Post in January, before the wedding, and sat across a desk from the new captain, a man named Aldrin who had been stationed out of Austin during the Brace years, and who had his own reasons for wanting the institution repaired, and they had a conversation that Edwin described to Louisa afterward as uncomfortable and productive in roughly equal measure. Aldrin did not offer him reinstatement immediately. He offered a probationary position as a scout and investigator, specifically for cases involving labor and property crimes in the Western District, a role that made use of what Edwin knew and what he had done, and that acknowledged, without stating it formally, that the man they were rehiring had earned a particular perspective on the difference between law and justice. Edwin took it. He took it with conditions of his own, including that Francisco Reyes and the other men from the settlement were to be afforded full cooperation with their claims for back wages from the Consolidated Pacific Estate, which the court had ordered liquidated to settle the judgment. This was agreed. Francisco, eventually received a formal letter of apology from the state, which was not nearly enough but was more than anyone had expected. Louisa and Edwin's life settled into a shape that was nothing like the life either of them had previously had, which they both agreed was considerably in its favor. They lived on the 40 acres, and Edwin came home from his scouting work every couple of weeks, and during the intervals wrote letters that were longer and more forthcoming than his spoken conversation, which Louisa found surprising and deeply satisfying, and she wrote back at equal length, and the letters she saved, and the ones she suspected he did too. In whatever careful private place, a man keeps the things that matter most to him. The house was improved steadily and methodically over the following 2 years. Edwin had opinions about structures, derived from a lifetime of knowing how to fix them, and Louisa had opinions about living spaces, derived from a lifetime of inhabiting them, and they discovered that these two sets of opinions were almost always compatible, and when they weren't, the disagreements were the kind that ended with both of them laughing, which she considered an excellent outcome for a disagreement. They added a room in the spring of 1885 because it was needed. Their son arrived in October of that year on a cool, clear night when the stars over West Texas were so vivid they looked painted, and he was born with Edwin's jaw and Louisa's eyes, and a set of opinions he communicated immediately and at considerable volume. They named him Daniel Edwin Trask, the first name for the man who had sent Louisa west with a deed and a hope, the middle name for the man who had come out of a rainstorm to make that hope into something real. Hester arrived the morning after and held the baby and pronounced him extremely sensible-looking, which was her highest compliment, and which made Edwin laugh for the first time in Hester's presence, a warm sound that visibly surprised her, and then made her smile in the way she smiled when she tried not to and failed. Francisco and Maria came the following Sunday with their children, and a pot of Maria's tamales, and the particular warmth of people who have been through something difficult together, and come out the other side of it as genuine friends. Francisco held the baby with the practiced ease of a man who had children of his own and said something to him quietly in Spanish that Louisa did not catch, and then looked up and said to Edwin and Louisa together, "He will know the whole story, yes, not just the comfortable parts." "All of it," Edwin said, "when he's old enough to hear it." "Good," Francisco said. "Stories told whole are more useful than stories told clean." Louisa, sitting in the chair by the window with the Texas light coming in, and Maria beside her and her son, making the small sounds of a person encountering the world with fresh indignation, looked at Edwin across the room, and he met her eyes, and the look between them was the private language they had been developing for 2 years now, the one made of shared history and specific knowledge, and the particular ease that comes when two people have proven, through difficulty, that they are reliably themselves in each other's company. 2 years after Daniel's birth, in the winter of 1887, Louisa discovered she was expecting again. She told Edwin on a Sunday evening when he was home, and they were sitting by the stove with the cold coming down hard from the north, and Daniel, now a vigorous and conversational 2-year-old, asleep in the added room. She told him in the straightforward way she told him most things, without preamble, and watched his face move through surprise and into something large and quiet, the same expression she had seen on him the night on the porch when she said she was going to say yes. "When?" he asked. "July," she said. "Give or take." He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her chair and took her hands and looked at her with that fully unguarded face that she had first seen in her garden in the late September light 2 years before their wedding, and he said, "You know I'm going to worry." "I know," she said. "You worry about me when I go to Crestfall for supplies. I'm aware that another child will cause you to reach impressive new heights of concern. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is among the most endearing things about you." He kissed her hands, both of them, and she ran her fingers through his hair, which had a few gray threads in it now at 36. And she thought about the roof in the rain and the stone with the note beneath it and the 2 initials that had changed everything. And she felt, with a completeness that she had not previously known was possible, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Their daughter arrived in August of 1887, 3 weeks past Louisa's estimate, as though she had her own ideas about scheduling, which proved to be entirely consistent with her subsequent character. They named her Clara, for Galveston and loyalty, and the letter that had found its way to the right judge at the right time. Clara Trask had her father's stillness and her mother's precision, and spent her earliest years in a state of extreme observational intensity that gave everyone the impression she was filing information away for future use. The roof that Edwin had fixed in the storm held for 4 more years, at which point it was replaced entirely, properly this time, with Edwin doing the work himself on a clear October afternoon while Louisa handed up shingles, and Daniel, now 6 and deeply interested in the mechanics of everything, observed from below with his hands behind his back like a small foreman. "Is it good?" Louisa called from the porch. "It's good," Edwin called down. "Better than the first time." A pause. "I had better conditions. You had a thunderstorm and midnight and a stranger's roof," she said. "You did exceptional work." "I was motivated," he said, and came down the ladder and stood on the porch and looked at the house with the satisfaction of someone who has made something solid, and then looked at her beside him, and there was no distance in that look at all. "You know," Louisa said, leaning against him, "I stood at the door that night. I had my hand on the latch when you left." "I know," he said. She looked up at him. "You know. I saw the light under the door change when you came to it," he said. "I was at the bottom of the steps." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you come back?" "I thought," he said carefully, "that a woman alone had more important things to deal with than who was on her porch in the dark, that the roof was fixed, that I didn't have the right to ask for more than that." "You left a note," she said. "I left a note," he agreed. "E.T.," she said, "2 letters, on a piece of paper under a stone. It seemed like the right amount." She looked at him for a long time, and he looked back at her, and the October light fell across the repaired roof and the porch boards that had been replaced twice now, and the garden that had grown and changed through 3 seasons of their life together. "It was," she said finally. "It was exactly the right amount." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Daniel came up the porch steps with a shingle nail he had found in the grass, which he presented with some gravity, and Edwin took it from him with equal gravity and thanked him for the important recovery, and Daniel nodded with the satisfaction of useful work and went back to his investigation of the yard. Clara could be heard inside, engaged in something that sounded constructive or possibly destructive, with the set of wooden blocks that Francisco's eldest child had outgrown and gifted over. The canyon road ran south in the late afternoon light, empty and sun-gilded, the same road Edwin had ridden that September night when the storm came down, and the roof failed and everything, without anyone planning it, began. Hester came for supper that evening, as she did most Sundays, and pronounced the roof repair sound, and ate 2 portions of the beef stew, and held Clara on her knee and told her about the correct method of shelling beans, which Clara attended to with her characteristic focused gravity, and argued with Edwin about the most efficient post-hole configuration for the south fence extension, and told Louisa that the sewing circle in Crestfall had asked if she was taking new commissions because Mrs. Aldrin, the new captain's wife, required a formal dress for the Ranger Association dinner in the spring, which was not an unimportant opportunity. "I'll send a note on Monday," Louisa said. "You should charge her properly," Hester said. "She can afford it." "I always charge properly," Louisa said. "You undercharge," Hester said. "You have always undercharged." "Hester, it's a persistent flaw." Edwin caught Louisa's eye across the table, and the look between them was the quiet shared laughter of people who have memorized each other's world. She pressed her lips together and served him more stew, and Hester continued her assessment of regional embroidery rates with the confidence of a woman who has an opinion on everything, and is correct with sufficient frequency to have earned the right to it. Later, after Hester had gone home in her wagon and the children were asleep and the dishes were done, Edwin and Louisa sat on the porch in the dark the way they had sat on the first night of their engagement, in the cold, clear air, with stars above the canyon country that went on forever. "I've been thinking," Edwin said. "That's never entirely without consequence," she said. "Aldrin wants me to consider a full reinstatement," he said. "Not just the scout position, full commission." She was quiet, looking at the stars. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. "I feel," he paused, "like it matters, like the work matters, like I know what I'm doing it for now in a way I didn't before." He looked at her, "But it would mean more time away." "It would," she said. "I don't like that part." "No," she said, "I don't either." So, she thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which she could do with him, lay things out plainly and think aloud without managing the presentation. "The work is good work," she said. "The kind that needs doing and that not everyone can do. You know the terrain and you know the failures of the institution from the inside, which makes you better at preventing them." She paused. "Daniel is going to want to know what his father does and why. Clara is going to want to know the same. I would rather they see a man who chose something important over something comfortable." He looked at her in the dark. "You are," he said, "going to make me take this commission." "You were going to take it," she said. "You wanted to know if I thought it was right." "Yes," he admitted. "It's right," she said. "Come home when you can, right when you can't, I will be here." He took her hand. She leaned against him and they sat in the dark above the canyon country while the stars turned over them. And the house behind them was warm and solid and full, and the roof over all of it was new and sound and would not fail in the rain. Edwin Trask was fully reinstated to the Texas Rangers in January of 1888, and the document of reinstatement sat in the leather case on the shelf in the front room, alongside the deed to the 40 acres and the letters they had written each other during the difficult weeks, and the note that said, "Roof should hold now. Sorry about the garden." E.T. which Louisa had kept pressed between the pages of her Bible, and which she took out sometimes and held in the light, not with sorrow but with a particular kind of wonder at the way small things determine the shape of a life. The garden, it should be said, had recovered entirely. It recovered the spring after the storm, which had washed the soil through and left it, as storms sometimes do, more fertile than before. She grew beans and squash and tomatoes, and a patch of sunflowers along the east fence that she had put in the second summer, partly because they were useful and partly because she had simply decided her garden deserved something that was purely beautiful. And Edwin had never questioned this decision, had only one afternoon stood at the fence looking at them in the late light with an expression that she recognized as happiness in his specific quiet form. She planted more the following year. The sunflowers were large and reliable, and turned to follow the sun with a faithful patience that she found, without being sentimental about it, entirely suited to the character of the land and the life and the man who came home to it. In the spring of 1890, when Daniel was 4 and Clara was 2, and the canyon country was green from a wet winter, Louisa sat on the porch in the early morning and watched the sunrise come up over the east ridge in colors that the painters in Galveston would have died for, and she thought, not for the first time, about the chain of it. The fever that took Daniel Turner, the debt that sent her west, the storm that failed the roof. The midnight knock that was not a threat but a question, the note under the stone, her own note back, the coffee that had gone cold and been offered warm, the ledger pages in Francisco's tin box, the ring made from a found stone, the church in Crestfall in March, the children asleep inside. She thought about the way the things that break us are sometimes the things that open us. Not always, not reliably. Life was not a mechanism with reliable outputs, but sometimes the collapse of what we had built becomes the clearing where something better can stand. Edwin came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, the way he often did when he was home and she was on the porch in the morning, and he gave her one and sat beside her and they watched the sunrise together with the ease of people who have done this many times and expect to do it many more. "Clara was up in the night," he said. "I heard," she said. "She went back to sleep. She had a dream about the chickens. She worries about them. She shouldn't, they're robust birds. Louisa smiled and drank her coffee, and the canyon country lit up in the morning sun, gold and amber and the deep reddish-brown of the caprock. And the gray horse was in the paddock Edwin had built the previous autumn, and the new roof was solid above them, and the garden was just beginning to wake in the warming air, the first green shoots of the season coming through the dark earth with the patient certainty of things that know it is time. "I was thinking," Louisa said. "That is also never without consequence," Edwin said. "More sunflowers," she said. "Along the north fence this time." He looked at the north fence, assessed it with the practical eye he applied to everything, found no structural objection. "Whatever you need," he said. She leaned against him. He put his arm around her. The sun came fully up over the ridge and filled the canyon with light, and the house was warm behind them, and the 40 acres were theirs, properly theirs, a place made not from money or luck but from persistence and honesty, and the willingness to open the door, even in a storm, to whatever good thing might be standing in the rain. Whatever good thing. She looked at the river stone on the porch step, still there in its original place, a smooth gray stone from the creek, unremarkable to any eye but hers. She had never moved it. Some things stay where they belong. The coffee was hot. The morning was clear. The man beside her was hers, and she was his, and their children were asleep in the warm house behind them. And the roof was sound, and the garden would bloom, and the road south through the canyon country would always, in some part of her, be the road she watched him come back on, riding at a measured walk so she would see him coming, giving her time to set down whatever she was doing and simply wait, which was the most generous thing one person could offer another. The gift of being anticipated, the gift of being someone's reason to come home. Edwin Trask had fixed her roof in the rain and left before she could open the door to thank him. And that single act of quiet, unclaimed goodness had set in motion everything she had, everything she was, everyone she loved, every morning with coffee and sunlight, and the canyon opening up before her in its ancient, unhurried beauty. She had the note still. She would always have it. 2 initials and a practical sentence and a small apology about the garden that she had always found, in its restraint and its humanity, the most perfectly characteristic thing he had ever said. The garden was fine. The garden had always been fine. It had grown into something far beyond what she had planned when she first pressed the seeds into the Texas soil, which was, she thought, exactly what gardens do when you tend them faithfully and give them time and refuse to abandon them when the storms come through. The sunflowers would go in along the north fence. She would put them in next week, in the good wet soil of spring, and they would grow tall and reliable and turn toward the light. And Edwin would come home and stand at the fence and look at them with his quiet happiness. And Daniel would try to reach the heads and fail and try again. And Clara would watch all of it with her accumulated gravity and her father's still attention. And Hester would come on Sunday and pronounce them excessively romantic and eat 2 portions of whatever was on the stove. And Francisco and Maria would come for the holiday, and Francisco would tell the children something in Spanish that only he and they would know, and the canyon country would go on around all of them in its enormous indifferent beauty, holding them small and specific and alive within it. This was the life. This was the whole of it. Louisa Turner, who had become Louisa Trask in a small white church on a March morning with the Texas wind blowing clean and cold off the caprock, finished her coffee and put her head on her husband's shoulder and listened to the morning happen. And she was, without qualification or reservation or any shadow of the loneliness she had carried for 3 years before a storm came, and a stranger knocked, completely and irreversibly happy.